Perfect. Today, my guest is Professor Myles Shaver. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Myles as a person, Professor Shaver as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Myles is a fellow of the SMS, where he also serves as a board member. He was the program chair in 2020 conference. He was the track chair in 2014 Tel Aviv conference. He was also the track chair in the AIB's 2001 Sydney conference, which is my favorite, all-time favorite. He has served in various editorial positions. He's the senior editor at Strategy Science, was an editor at SMJ, associate editor at Management Science, consulting editor and department editor at JIBS. He was also the he was on the editorial boards of ASQ, Strategic Organization, or Org Science, and AOM Discoveries. Myles won the 2017 Best Paper Award at AOM, the Irwin Outstanding Educator Award in 2014, and Poets and Quants profiles Myles in their compilation of the world's 50 best business school professors. Thank you, Myles, for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
First question always is, what did you want to become when you were a child?
You know, probably when I was a small kid, I probably wanted to be a medical doctor. That was the only type of doctor I knew. So becoming a different type of doctor, though I have to admit, you know, it was either me or my wife, who was one of our advisors, or no, one of our close friends after we got our PhD, he mentioned, now remember, you're not the type of doctor that helps people. So
you're not the real doctor.
Yeah.
That's what my mom tells. Can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus foreign?
Yes. So I grew up in Western Canada, and when I was about 8, we moved to Australia for a year. My dad was working at that point as a consultant to the Australian government. So that had a huge impact on me because as an 8-year-old, my world was about as far as I could ride my bicycle. And then sort of all of a sudden after this cold winter day in Alberta, you know, a couple days later, I'm in Australia and it's a different world. And so very tangible way.
How did you choose the field? How did you choose to be an IB scholar?
Yeah, so after I finished my undergraduate degree, and so this was in the late 80s where Asia was booming and sort of the typical thoughts were, you know, American companies and European companies were dead and they're just being overrun by Asian companies. I happened to go on a study tour of Southeast Asia. And what was striking is, again, Asian companies were taking over the world, but if you actually talk to managers and the people within these companies and ask them how they were doing it and what the future, you know, held, they had way more questions than they had answers. And, you know, it's just a little bit of a reflection there that, you know, this is such an important phenomena in many ways. And the people at the center of it have more questions than they have answers. Isn't this something that we should know more about? This is important. So that's why I decided to study international business.
Interesting. If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would be your second best alternative career path?
So I like to say that if I wasn't doing this, I want to host diners, drive-ins, and dives on the Food Network. So, you know, so Guy Fieri, yeah, watch out.
Interesting. What's something not many people know about you, something that you wouldn't put on your CV?
No, so something along those lines is, I think, you know, over time, more of my hobby has become the issues of cooking. And I think part of that on reflection is, you know, so much of what we do, we invest today and do things, and then we see the payoff, you know, especially when it comes to papers, years later, or even in a class. And so to be able to spend some time and in the matter of hours have some output that you can actually sense or evaluate, and I like to eat. So those two marry well.
What's your signature dish?
So it's breaking out the smoker and ribs. So ribs would be the signature dish, followed probably by pork shoulders.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, let's talk about regrets. What is the one thing you wish you would have done, but you didn't?
Probably on a little bit of reflection, even as an undergrad, traveled a little bit more internationally. Because I think that's a good time in life to do it, but you're young, you don't know what all your other demands are, or the trade-offs or that. So in reflection, it's like, yeah, I would have liked to sort of broaden my horizons a little bit more that way.
I'm really intrigued about this cooking thing. How come we don't have a cooking show? Don't you want to do a little 20 minutes?
Who would listen to me on a cooking show? So,
well, who listens to me in an interview like this? But if the content is good.
no, that's true. Well, I will say that, every year our MBA students hold a charity auction.
Hmm.
I always offer up barbecue rib dinner at the house, and it's been very popular. So, I don't think I'd poison anyone, but I'm not sure anybody wants to listen to me. So.
Okay, what are you most passionate about and proud of?
So I think, on reflection there, and especially since we're on the personal side, it's my family. So, I have two boys and my wife, and, when I think, and I'll mention now, so when I get grumpy sometimes, like when I'm on the SMS board or things like that, when it comes to conferences, a lot of it is because, we're holding our conferences on weekends and things like that. And, I actually like spending time with my family. And so I like working when I'm working, and I like to spend time with them when I'm not. And sometimes I think that even some of the cadence or how we run certain events is not necessarily all that accommodating to that. And I have it easy, I'm not a single parent. I don't, all sorts of things like that. And that would even be harder for someone else. But yeah.
Beautiful. I would like to switch to the research segment now, if I may. Imagine you're stranded in a small village. You sought refuge in this little pub. Locals are curious about you. How do you explain your research in general terms to people who don't read your work regularly?
Yeah. So, when I thought about this, I think part of the problem is I work on a lot of different things. So I don't think I can explain it all. But how I'd like to explain it is, and, the type of thing, going back to even the way I answered your first question, this notion of it's, what's a practical problem or a problem that we don't necessarily understand how it influences not just businesses, but our society. So, is it a good thing that we have multinational companies, or why is that? Or, do you realize all the different ways that we benefit? You hear certain benefits of the companies making profits, but is that beneficial for us overall? Or why is it good that they do well? Why is it good that they don't fail? I want to understand that because it's important for those companies. It's important for the people who work in them, but it's also important for us all together, like in the society, and, who's impacted by those companies.
Myles, what are the omitted variables in IB research? What are the underutilized areas?
Questions like this always become one of taste. And so all this will reflect my taste. Personally, in some ways, the way that I've seen the field evolve, and, everybody has their own perspective. I see a lot less of questions about managing the organization, um, and managing it both a little bit, but sort of by its scope or how different elements are integrated in that. And those are really hard questions to study, especially hard questions to study empirically, but those are the ones that I find most exciting.
What's the next big question in IB then?
Yeah, no, so I think that, you know, and I know that there's many people out there working on this, and you know, they can write to me and tell me about their work because it probably means I don't understand it enough. But I think that, you know, as we've seen in the last several years, we have evolution in types of companies or types of competition. How does that map to as those companies span borders? And like I say, I think because that sort of marries the questions that personally I find more interesting about, you know, the organization itself and the choices it makes to operate in multiple countries. But, you know, how does it do that sort of given how we've seen technology and information change and all those types of things?
When you say evolution in the types of companies, are you do you mean geographically? Do you mean the composition, the organization of these firms?
And
What is
so
the
I'm thinking a little bit more organizationally than sort of just the geographic footprint. So how do they manage that exactly? And again, it's not that we don't know things about this, but I think that it's an area that especially, you know, there's clearly some very classic and, you know, profound studies, but these are hard data to get one's head around and to see what happens. And so, yeah, how is exactly the firm organized and who interacts with whom and things like that? I think these are really key.
let's talk about creativity. How where does creativity come from for you? What does your mind think of in this state of idle curiosity? What do you think about?
In terms of creativity, well, so I'm going to answer this. Let me take it down one path and you can redirect me if this is not interesting or not where you want to go. But again, I'll rant a little bit more. Sort of when I look at our profession of certain things, I think that we become very formulaic in how we sort of set research and write papers and things like that. So there's a particular structure, it's a hypothesis testing structure, and, you know, we sort of explain this theory and then we go out and sort of run regressions or partial correlations and we test it. To me, creativity means we should write more than one type of paper like that. And so, you know, some of the efforts that I made, you know, as an associate editor at Management Science, and so when Bruno was the editor of the business strategy division, was many more of these abductive papers. So, you know, we go to the data, we see what it is, and this should not just be restricted to qualitative data. And how does that help us build theory and inform theory? Now, you know, absolutely Academy of Management Discoveries and SMJ has said that they're open to question-based research. And I think that that's been a good trend, but some of us have been talking about this for 10 years or more. So I think creativity comes in all aspects of research, and each should be sort of celebrated. So I'll read a paper and somebody measures a concept differently than what we've done before. And, you know, I'll sit back and stop and go, wow, that's actually really profound if we want to understand this. And, you know, I've been engaged in conversations where people will dismiss that. It's like, oh, it's just how they're measuring something. It's like, in part of the whole sort of research domain, right? Coming up with a question and theorizing a question and measuring things and testing things, those are all elements. We have to do them all right. And creativity in any of those aspects, I think, is really important. And my own passions often point to more of the data type of issues and where I think that, you know, we can make strides.
Thank you. Last question in this segment. Which questions in IB are overly studied that is not fruitful to pursue anymore?
Yeah, well, okay. So, you know, I wrote this paper once, do we have too many entry mode studies? There was a reason I wrote it because I think my answer was yes. But, you know, I'd say the same type of thing that I say to my PhD students is, you know, there's questions that are heavily traveled. Sometimes, you know, sometimes that means that they're super important questions, which is fine. Sometimes, things are very incremental. And so, but I have to admit, there's been different lines of research that every once in a while, I've read a lot of papers, I'm not that excited by them, and somebody does something creative, right? Like measures something differently, or advances a theory, or sort of shows us that we were wrong. And all of a sudden it's like, I would have never thought that paper would have been interesting, and then they proved me wrong. So, you know, to the extent that there are any students out there listening to this and that, what I think is more important than, what do I think that are topics that are interesting or maybe overused is, I like to throw the challenge back to them. It's like, show me why I should be interested in this. And I have to admit, sometimes people have really made me go, wow, I would have never thought that was interesting, but having read that paper, listened to your presentation, that was fantastic.
I mean, as an editor, you see both the good ones and the bad ones. So you are looking at the population quite differently than most people. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit in it. I would like to switch to the advice part. What was the best advice you received for in your career?
So I think there's several, and my success has been reflected by so many people being generous with their time in many ways. But I remember this very vividly. I had just finished my PhD. I had started my job at NYU, and my dissertation was done. And honestly, I think probably most people, but just to reflect on my own insecurities, it's like, okay, well, I wrote a dissertation and I think it was okay. I'm going to have to generate a stream of research going forward. And so I was thinking of new ideas and beginning to work on them. And it was sort of a week or two in, and I think there's a little cocktail party for new faculty. And I was talking to the dean of faculty and sort of describing this. And his advice was, you know what? Soon you're going to find out the problem is not coming up with ideas. Any active researcher, being active in research generates lots of ideas. The real issue is how you manage them. And, that was sometimes you have to ask yourself, which idea is going to have more of an impact? Is this the one that continues going? He goes, and lots of us don't do that, but his advice was really, one should be really active in managing their portfolio of papers. And so I'd taken that to heart. And, I have a file on my computer where it's just called dead papers. And one of those papers, and this was still when I was an assistant professor, was in the proceedings at the academy and just what else I was working on at that time. It's like, it doesn't make sense for me to work on this now, even though I think it's a decent paper, and I just killed it. And so I think that becomes really important.
Who teaches this? Who teaches how to select good papers versus, I don't want to say dead papers, but ones that wouldn't really add more value to the portfolio? Who teaches?
Yeah, I don't think anybody teaches that. I think, how I've made my decision. So probably on one side, and this is maybe not necessarily the good side, it's like, how excited am I about it? Because, I think if we're honest, there's some papers we're more excited about than others. And, as we all know, this journey of getting things through the review process is generally not the most fun thing. And so if you're already sort of, I don't know about this paper, and then you get beat up a whole lot, it's like, it's hard to push forward. So some of my own personal excitement, but a lot of that is informed by, I think in times I like to talk to my professional friends about what I'm working on. And, this is what I'm working on. And if they're my professional, they are my friends, and some of them will tell me, yeah, I think that's sort of stupid, or, I don't know how interesting that is. And, nobody wants to hear that, but it's good to hear. And so it's either okay, can I make the case why this is interesting, or do they really have a point there? So it's both an internal how I feel about it, but I like to talk to people whom I respect and who are my professional friends, and their thoughts are important in helping me judge those.
Um, about the common mistakes that you see across the board, and you prepared a lot of, you trained a lot of PhD students. Most of my colleagues in my cohort, you trained them. What are the top 3 mistakes that people usually do early in their career?
So one I would say is they don't kill papers.
Hmm.
And let me reflect this again, just a little personal pet peeve. I don't know how many times I've been to sort of PhD consortia or junior faculty consortia, and I'll hear people give advice like, oh, really you should get try to get 2 or 3 papers out of your dissertation or whatever number that is. And my advice is you should try and get as many papers out of that dissertation that there are papers. And there are some dissertations where that's 0. I mean, look, you've done all the work, things don't pan out, or the field's moved on, or the data aren't or such that it's going to be really hard to get it through the review process. And, people just investing a lot of time and a lot of emotional energy working on something that if they took a step back and said, does it really make sense to go forward with that? They might reach a different question. So I think one of the mistakes is, to try and understand, especially early on, a dissertation has a particular job, and ideally it leads to all sorts of papers and publications, but you can't force things that aren't there. Or I see people slicing, I've seen this especially as an editor, you can tell it's a dissertation and people are slicing things too thin, right? They're trying to get multiple papers out, and if they kept a couple ideas together, they'd have a much more powerful and impactful paper. But because they're trying to make multiple papers, that they're struggling to get any one of them published. So, and I say this, and it's always easy for me to look at somebody else's work and portfolio and make this judgment. I wish I could see it as well in my own papers because I make those mistakes.
Which skills are most difficult to develop but most valuable going forward?
Yeah. Again, this is going to reflect my own biases. So I'm a big believer that the key thing in a PhD is to make sure one is grounded well in one's PhD program, is make sure one is grounded well technically. I have to thank Bernie Young for saying this. He's like, sometimes you have to ask yourself the question, what's it easier to do to sit down and do yourself? Read through an econometrics textbook or read through an SMJ article? And if you, think that the technical thing is harder to do, that's often where, you have a constraint on how much classwork you can take. Make sure you get those. Those will help you. And it's not that the other things aren't important, but that's a type of grounding. So, I think it's important that one leaves with a level of technical grounding because that will be the basis of you continuing to learn those things over time. But I think that the hardest thing, and again, especially as an empirical scholar, is developing the intuition of how do you map some of these technical issues to what the underlying data problems in the real world look like, and to get that intuition. So, we will run through a statistics class, we'll talk about the assumptions, we go, yeah, we know why they're important. We often don't develop, or at least it took me a while to develop a better intuition about, well, what would ever cause that assumption to be violated? And once you begin to know that, I think you begin to ask better questions of yourself when it comes to designing research and doing empirical research.
Last question. Always, what's the one question that I should have asked you but didn't?
Yeah,
now the classic answer is you ask everything and then we stop and then there's always one more.
No, I think you covered a lot of things. What I like about the questions is at least you didn't ask me all the questions to just make me rant. I got a few of those in, but I'll say is, over time one develops, their own opinions or thoughts about doing research. And I feel very passionate about that. And so, maybe this would be the one question or the one comment is, personally, I consider doing research takes a certain emotional energy to do well. At least I find that. And so if all my emotional energy is being used elsewhere, I find it really hard to be productive. And so, going back to one of the things we mentioned early on is, yeah, I'm not afraid. I'd like to think I'm not afraid to work hard and things like that, but being smart about keeping my life in balance in some ways, and that makes me more productive because it keeps that emotional energy.
It was a very delicious interview. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Those are great questions. I really enjoyed it.
I'm really serious. A series on this video on how to cook, cooking by Shaver method, something related to it. It should be in the works. Hopefully we'll watch it soon. Thank you, Myles. Thank you for this great interview. I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thanks.
Thank you.